The first time Ethan Cole saw Amara Lewis, she was polishing the glass wall outside his corner office, her reflection blurring against the skyline. He didn't know her name then, just saw a uniform, not a person, and dismissed her with the same casual arrogance that had built his empire. To him, she was background noise in a life of meetings, mergers, and market wars. That morning, he'd been furious. A global deal was collapsing because a translator had botched a key negotiation in Tokyo, and his company stood to lose $1 billion overnight. So when Amara accidentally bumped her cart against the glass, he snapped. "Watch where you're going!" he barked, the words cold enough to shatter the air. She bowed her head slightly, murmuring something that didn't sound like English. Ethan rolled his eyes. He barely noticed the sentence that slipped past her lips in flawless Japanese, quietly correcting the exact legal term that had sunk his deal. Later that afternoon, the mistake resurfaced in the boardroom. Ethan's legal team struggled to decode the translation issue on the massive screen. Everyone argued in circles until a quiet voice spoke from the doorway. "If you change Chote to Wakai, the contract will hold," Amara said softly, her accent precise. The room went silent. The executives turned, startled to see the same woman they'd ignored all morning. Ethan's jaw tightened, half disbelief, half embarrassment. "How do you know that word?" he demanded. She met his stare without flinching. "Because I studied international law before life took a different turn." The boardroom hung in stunned silence as she rewrote the key clause in Japanese, then repeated it in French and Mandarin to confirm consistency. The contract that had been falling apart stitched itself back together in minutes. Ethan didn't move, watching the Maid he had mocked rescue everything he had built, one language at a time. When the deal finally closed, the press called it the $1 billion comeback. Ethan knew better. That victory belonged to the woman who walked home each night carrying 2 jobs and a stack of worn textbooks. Over the next few days, he found himself haunted by the memory of her calm intelligence, the dignity in her voice, the quiet pain behind her composure. For the first time, the man who owned everything felt small. And in that humility, something inside him shifted. What began as shame turned into resolve, to listen, to learn, to see the people he had spent a lifetime overlooking. Because sometimes, he realized, salvation doesn't arrive in suits and headlines. It comes with calloused hands, carrying a mop, speaking 9 languages the world never bothered to hear. Ethan Cole believed order was proof of power. Every morning, the 43rd floor of his glass tower glowed spotless, the skyline reflecting off surfaces polished so clean they looked invisible. He liked it that way. Nothing out of place, nothing he didn't control. The only sound he tolerated was the whisper of the city far below. Until, one Monday, that silence cracked. A clatter echoed behind him. He turned sharply, coffee trembling in his cup. A cleaning cart had bumped against the wall of his office. The woman pushing it froze. She wore the company's gray uniform, a name tag that read Amara, and an expression that mixed apology with weariness. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, but her voice carried an accent he couldn't place. "It was an accident." Ethan exhaled hard. "Be careful next time," he muttered, already looking back at the stack of contracts glowing on his tablet. The Tokyo merger was falling apart. A mistranslated clause threatened to erase months of work and a $1 billion valuation. He didn't have time for distractions. But as Amara bent to pick up a fallen folder, she glanced at the figures on his screen. Her brow furrowed almost imperceptibly. "Excuse me," she said softly. "That second line, it shouldn't say chote. It means arbitration, not settlement." He looked up, surprised. "What did you just say?" She hesitated, then repeated the word, explaining in perfect Japanese and then English how the term would alter the legal scope. The correction rolled from her tongue as naturally as breathing. For a moment, Ethan just stared. The room hummed with quiet astonishment. "You speak Japanese?" "Among others," she said simply, straightening the folder in her hands. "I studied translation and international law at university. Before—" She stopped herself, offered a faint, polite smile, and returned to her cart. He should have thanked her. Instead, pride got there first. "That'll be all," he said, voice clipped. She nodded and disappeared down the corridor, leaving behind a silence thicker than before. That night, the boardroom turned into a battlefield. Executives argued over the contract while Ethan fought to keep his composure. He couldn't stop replaying Amara's correction. When the team stalled again on the translation, he finally muttered, Try changing Chote to Wakai. They did, and the entire deal unlocked. A murmur rippled through the room as numbers realigned and red marks turned green. Ethan stared at the success flashing across the screens, but triumph tasted hollow. The victory belonged to someone cleaning floors 2 stories down. The next morning, he found her in the lobby wiping down chrome railings. About yesterday, he began awkwardly. She turned, calm as ever. You fixed the deal, he said. You were right. She blinked, uncertain whether it was gratitude or interrogation. I'm glad it helped. Where did you learn all that? He asked. Books mostly, she said. And the people who never noticed I was listening. There was no arrogance in her tone, only quiet truth. It unsettled him. For years, Ethan had surrounded himself with experts who echoed his confidence. Now a woman earning hourly wages had exposed how shallow that confidence really was. Over the next few days, he caught himself watching her more closely. Not out of suspicion, but curiosity. He noticed how she switched languages with tourists in the lobby, comforting a frightened child in Spanish, greeting a delivery driver in Swahili. Each time she spoke, the world around her softened. She wasn't invisible. He simply hadn't looked properly. When Friday came, Ethan gathered his team to renegotiate the final stage of the merger. Amara passed by with her cart just as the video call began. The Japanese delegate on screen raised a concern no one understood, his translator stumbling. Without thinking, Ethan waved Amara over. Would you mind listening for a second? She hesitated, then leaned closer to the speakerphone, listening intently before translating both sides with precision. In 5 minutes, she solved what hours of meetings hadn't. When the call ended, applause broke out across the table. Ethan turned to her. You just saved this company. Amara's eyes flicked to the shining floor. No, sir, she said quietly. I just did what I was trained to do. Then she excused herself, pushing the cart down the hall while the executives whispered in disbelief. That evening, alone in his office, Ethan watched her disappear into the elevator lobby. The mop handle balanced across her shoulder like a banner. The city lights glimmered below, but for once he didn't feel above them. He'd spent years believing intelligence wore a suit, that wisdom came with a salary. Now the truth was mopping his floor. He picked up his phone and scrolled through contacts filled with names that suddenly meant less. The last thing he saw before the screen dimmed was his reflection in the glass wall. Sharp suit, tired eyes, and behind him, faint streaks of soap where she had cleaned. For the first time, he wondered which one of them actually saw the world clearly. Ethan didn't sleep much that weekend. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Amara's steady expression and heard the calm confidence in her voice. It wasn't embarrassment that kept him awake anymore. It was curiosity. How did someone with that level of skill end up cleaning floors in his building? By Monday morning, he decided he couldn't keep pretending she didn't exist. He found her in the atrium, stacking supplies onto a trolley. Amara, he said carefully. She looked up, unsure whether she was in trouble. I'd like to talk about work. Her shoulders tensed. If there's a problem, I'll fix it. There isn't, he said. I need your help. He led her to a small conference room and set a document in front of her. We're expanding in Geneva. The contracts are in French and Italian. My team can't agree on a translation. She glanced over the papers once, her brow furrowing in concentration, then began to mark corrections in a fine, neat hand. Within minutes, the pages looked alive again, words balanced and precise. When she finished, she slid them back across the table. That should hold legally in both languages, she said. He read her edits, astonished. You're fluent in both? And several dialects, she said, almost apologetically. I worked as an interpreter when I first came to the city, before the firm folded. The weight of her story settled between them. You shouldn't be cleaning offices, he said. She smiled faintly. It's honest work. It keeps me close to books. That answer stayed with him all afternoon. 2 weeks later, the Geneva deal closed without a flaw. Investors congratulated Ethan for his brilliant linguistic insight, but he corrected them. The insight belonged to someone else, he said, and then he told the board about Amara. There was silence, the kind that means people are recalculating everything they thought they knew. By the end of the meeting, he had authorized a new position, cultural and linguistic advisor, and handed it to her. When he told Amara, she froze, mop still dripping. Sir, I don't think you're overqualified for what you're doing, he interrupted. Please take it. She studied him, searching for any trace of pity. Finding none, she nodded. "All right," she said quietly, "but I'll earn it." From that day, the company began to change. Employees who had never noticed the cleaning staff started learning their names. Meetings opened with greetings in different languages. The atmosphere softened as if Amara's calm discipline had soaked into the walls themselves. Ethan watched the shift with a mixture of pride and humility. For the first time, he felt like a leader rather than an owner. Late one evening, after everyone else had gone, he passed Amara's office. She was still there, surrounded by dictionaries and digital screens, rewriting a contract line by line. "You should go home," he said. She looked up and smiled. "Home is wherever I can make sense of chaos." He nodded, understanding more than he could say. When the company landed its largest international client that quarter, the announcement credited Amara Lewis and the cross-cultural team. The applause that followed was thunderous. Ethan stood at the back of the room, clapping until his hands hurt. Pride no longer felt selfish. It felt shared. Outside nightlights flickered across the skyline. Ethan lingered by the glass wall that once reflected only himself. Now he saw the faint outlines of dozens of people behind him, Amara among them, turning the reflection into something larger than his own shadow. For the first time in years, the view from the top didn't make him feel alone. Spring arrived with the city in full bloom. The glass tower that once felt sterile now buzzed with energy, voices from every language echoing across its halls. What had begun as a single act of respect had rippled outward, reshaping the entire company. Ethan watched his employees trade ideas with teams from Africa, Asia, and Europe. Where he had once demanded uniformity, he now encouraged curiosity. The walls he'd built in his mind had quietly come down. Amara's new department thrived. She created mentorship programs for immigrant workers, partnered with universities, and taught staff how to navigate cultural nuance in international trade. The company's profits rose, but Ethan cared more about the quiet victories. The janitor who was now studying accounting at night. The receptionist who'd launched a charity with corporate backing. When reporters asked what had changed, Ethan said, "We started listening." A year after that first conversation in the corridor, the firm hosted a global summit. Delegates from a dozen countries filled the grand hall, translators whispering through headsets. At the center table, Amara moderated with calm precision, switching between languages so seamlessly that the room seemed to breathe with her rhythm. Ethan watched from the wings, not as a boss but as a student who finally understood the lesson. When the conference concluded, the delegates rose in applause, not for him but for the woman who had turned humility into leadership. Later, as the crowd thinned, Ethan approached her. "You changed everything," he said. Amara shook her head. "You changed the way you saw people. That's all it ever takes," he smiled. "Then let's keep doing it." They stood for a moment, looking out at the city lights beyond the glass wall, no longer a barrier, but a mirror reflecting a world they now shared. That night, Ethan walked through the office alone. Cleaning crews moved quietly through the corridors, and he stopped to thank each one by name. It was a small gesture, but it felt honest. In his office, he turned off the monitors that once recorded every corner of the building. For the first time, he didn't need them. The trust he'd learned from Amara was a better safeguard than any camera. Outside, rain began to fall, soft, steady, cleansing. Ethan stepped out onto the terrace, letting it soak his tailored suit. Far below, streetlights shimmered on the wet pavement like threads of silver. He thought of the day he'd mocked a woman for bumping her cart against his wall, and how that single moment had rewritten his entire life. The rain tasted cold, real, and new. Inside on his desk, the latest company report bore Amara's signature beside his own. Under the mission statement, one line had been added in her careful handwriting. "Respect has no accent." Ethan read it twice, then smiled. The empire he'd built finally had a soul, and somewhere in the hum of the city, he could almost hear Amara's calm voice again. Steady, multilingual, and endlessly human, reminding him that greatness begins the moment we choose to listen. Moral: true intelligence is not measured by how many people you command, but by how deeply you understand those you once overlooked.